if you don't mind. If it's okay with you, I think we can start. People might just trickle in, but that way we don't have to go over time. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. I'm not sure where you guys are based. My name is Rafael Verbuyst, and I'll be chairing this session. I'm an anthropologist and historian at Ghent University in Belgium, and I'm doing a postdoc project at the moment about indigenous peoples' activism and contemporary settler colonialism in South Africa. We're in the panel D1, Film, Pedagogy and History, and the session is going to run until 1 o'clock Mexican time. We have 3 people presenting here today in the panel. In just a moment, I'm going to briefly introduce each of them just before they speak. They'll all have more or less 20 minutes to speak, and if that's okay with you, I'm just remind you either in the chat, well, let me just first try in the chat, just to tell you if you have like 5 minutes left or something. And if we're getting close to time, I'll just have to gently interrupt you and notify you of that. So sorry for that in advance. And then after the presentations, we can obviously do a Q&A, which you should have plenty of time for. So great, I'm excited. I'm gonna introduce the first speaker, which is Shanice Bernicky. Shanice Bernicky is a media maker and second-year PhD student at Carleton University. As a freelance video editor, she has worked on a myriad of projects on rich topics such as indigenous law and practices outside of the settler Canadian legal framework, the validity of English-speaking communities in Quebec, and environmental issues connecting the East and the West. Her research interests include post-colonial studies, research methods, and the relationship between identity, belonging, and equity, diversity, and inclusion practices in settler colonial studies. All right, Shanice, I give the floor to you. You're muted. Okay,
yes,
great.
Yes. I'm just preparing my slides, if that's okay.
Sure.
All righty. Okay. Thank you for that introduction, Rafael. I'm delighted to be here, albeit virtually, today. I'd first like to start off by acknowledging that I'm joining you all from the territories of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, who have been the original custodians of these lands and waters from which I grow since time immemorial. I acknowledge the land and its original caregivers not as a checkbox routine exercised in my home country, but because of it is this colonial context, as well as the shared global historical lineage that my research, regardless of the topic, stems. I say this land acknowledgement to position myself in a period of time that is moving towards something considered decolonial, but must be anti-colonial. For this presentation, Research Creation as Method, Community Agency, and Remediated Histories, I hope to 1. Discuss research creation as method, 2. Introduce the nonlinear interactive web documentary format. I know that Dr. Kim Nelson has presented a comprehensive and critical presentation on this yesterday. And 3. Finally, explore research creation as a meeting place for anti-oppressive methodologies and its affordances in academia to incorporate other epistemologies. In the communication and media studies field in which I find myself, research creation has both a rich and burgeoning history. This method stemmed from the United Kingdom as practice-based research, where research is directly informed by undertaking a creative and oftentimes collaborative project. Drawing from communication scholars Kim Sawchuk and Owen Chapman's text entitled Research Creation, Intervention, Analysis, and Family Resemblances in my own work, I embrace the creation as research approach because, quote, it is a form of directed exploration to creative processes that include experimentation, but also analysis, critique, and a profound engagement with theory and method questions of methods, end quote. At my previous academic institution, Concordia University, I had the privilege of completing a research creation option thesis, something that very few departments in the social sciences and humanities in Canada offer. However, media studies is a vastly interdisciplinary field that blends together sociology, fine arts, philosophy, science and technology studies, and many more disciplines, drawing from them their respective methods to conduct research. I've also noticed that a lot of the times in these institutions, we'll be showcasing the artistic works of faculty members as well. This said, the final course evaluation for students at the undergraduate and graduate level continues to be the classic written term paper with a thesis, body paragraphs to demonstrate evidence, and a summative conclusion that links back to the very beginning. Though I must admit that this format may not be my strong suit. Research creation presents twists and turns, and every project stands alone on its own with its own format conducive to the topic at hand, and sometimes the artistic medium of the primary researcher's choice. In this slide, I present to you some research creation works. Maze Longboat's master's thesis, Terra Nova, a video game which imagines the first contact between space settlers and Earth-born and bound Indigenous peoples light years after the Earth became considered inhospitable. We are invited not only to imagine this fraught yet hopeful future, but to interact with it from both perspectives. The game pulls forward injustice, and the game is only won, for lack of a better word, through reconciliation. Secondly, Steffi McKnight and Julia Chan's Cam Hunters, that started off as a web series with both video segments to interrogate surveillance. This project began with a single video checking Airbnbs for cameras and other hidden spyware, and has become an ongoing project to incorporate non-traditional methods of research that should be incorporated into the academic fold. Another, by Matt Soar, is the Montreal Sign Project that has been ongoing since 2010, that collects iconic signs from across the city of Montreal, not only to preserve them, but to trace their lives from conception, creation, fixing, and beyond. The past of these signs are well documented, but by placing them in new homes like Loyola Campus at Concordia in Montreal, their presence and lineage is experienced differently and constantly being written as the project and the new home building develops. Each of these projects explores a myriad subjects, but ultimately are committed to the method of research creation as a forum to not only disseminate knowledge, but through the process of creating, generate knowledge itself. While I continue to collect research creation projects for future study, for the purpose of this presentation, I decided to narrow into interactive web documentaries to provide some level of consistency, but I always find my way back to research creation. As technologies advance, so does the documentary film form. No longer are they consumed solely in a linear manner. They can be nonlinear, interactive, and minimally mediated. Software such as Clint and Korsakov are the most known for their affordability and user-friendly experience, allowing most artists familiar with video editing basics to create stories that are fluid and have fluid narratives. According to co-director Matt Soar, he posits that, quote, the implication here is that an ideal case assembling algorithmically editing a database documentary in Korsakov can be understood as a motivated and consequential process in which a contingent set of related meanings is created and recreated as the piece is built, exported, tested, redefined, re-exported, tested again before the final export and publication, end quote. Soar connects the Korsakov documentary to Slack and Wise's theory of articulation. But what I propose is that most nonlinear documentaries, whether created in Clint or Korsakov or by a team of coders, possesses this very same quality. What nonlinear documentaries allow for is the user or viewer to pick up their trajectory, thus selecting a historical timeline they will be presented with. This timeline can present alternative histories which trouble the widely assumed history of an event. Take, for example, you'll see it just kind of sliding on the screen, Katarina Zizek's Supreme Law, an interactive documentary film interestingly categorized by Canada's National Film Board as a web experience. Zizek's experience brings together YouTubers, social media activists, and public-facing historians from across the country to explore Canada's constitutional acts and critical political events from multiple perspectives. To cultural theorist Jennifer Darrell Slack, articulation is not just a connection of meanings, but, and I quote, "Articulation is the process of creating connections, much in the same way that hegemony is not dominating, but the process of creating and maintaining consensus or of coordinating interests," end quote. Articulation through this process is never finished and can be decoded and configured into many different things. Although articulations are a series of connections which are constantly being rearranged, certain links between subjects are stronger than others, and all subjects do not necessarily have to be linked. And I did my best to kind of graphically orient this when you see this kind of little mind map here at the bottom. Slack, channeling political theorist Ernesto Laclau and cultural studies scholar Stuart Hall, establishes the importance of building, rearranging, and breaking connections which present a specific subject or position. As with hegemony, it is not only the base and the superstructure that determine the outcome, but everything in between connected together to form this massive mind map of a current hegemonic discourse. Though most nonlinear interactive web documentary films are still mediated, they do allow for constant editing and immediate publishing of the final product if the creators choose to do so and if the software is still available. This process is unlike writing a history book or producing a linear film, which are static in comparison and are completed and don't provide the same amount of agency. And this agency that viewers find allows them to not only select the path they wish to take, but also to step out of the world and return when they would like. Moreover, this interactive format does not assume a finite ending, but rather confesses to present only snippets of a past with multiple viewpoints and realities. This led me to think, if nonlinear web documentaries commits to no single past, perhaps this is an instance of Homi K. Bhabha's projected past. Quote, "The post-colonial passage to modernity produces a form of repetition. The past is projective. The time lag of post-colonial modernity moves forward, erasing the compliant past tethered to a myth of progress, ordered in the binaries of its cultural logic, past, present, inside, outside," end quote. The projected past, as Bhabha describes, brings forth a residual past, not to reminisce, but to map out emergent present and to introduce new possible futures. What happens, as seen by Michael Henote's Roxham Road, it's actually more of a VR, but now it lives as a web documentary, is a timeless terrain, as you can see here as it kind of scans the screen. This is me working through it. And I believe that this is the timeless terrain, that one that Bhabha might describe as a liminal space, where the marginalized and the dominant can come together to free themselves of a narrative heavy with binaries by way of reflection. For these binaries, not to be written over, but to instead to be seen for what they are, mythical. By no means are the stories of the migrants attempting to cross the border between New York and Quebec mythical, but the fixity on one sole narrative is. And this relinquishing of fixity disrupts a Eurocentric notion of time. Indigenous studies scholar Linda Tukey-White-Smith, in a chapter, Research Through the Imperial Eyes, traces the colonial roots of Western research methods. In the text, Smith identifies breaks in knowledge that need to be addressed. For instance, Smith discusses individuality and society. Here, the categorization of self is deconstructed, becoming a foreign and bizarre piece. The categorization of the individual is a central component of society, was not and is not present in Indigenous communities that were colonized. Community and holistic approaches to governance are a central way of life for many marginalized collectives. For me, the interactive documentary films, such as Roxanne Road that we saw in the previous slide, and the research creation work of especially Longboat's video game, do not tell the story of one individual with human characteristics, but also place the environment as an active entity who influences the construction of the future. Similarly, Smith explores space and time. Smith discusses time and space were not always distinct elements, but rather joint expressions of reality. Space became something to be owned and controlled following colonization, but space can be unpredictable. In the case of the nonlinear documentaries, their coded landscapes are fragile, and if not maintained and cared for, are unviewable and inaccessible to us. In feminist film and contemporary art scholar Natalie Loveless's edited collection, Knowings and Nots, practitioners, theorists, and community activists come together to review the capabilities of research creation in capturing and extending affective, queer, anti-racist, and anti-colonial intervention. Loveless's research creation practice asks researchers to evaluate how they do, what they do, and for whom. I come back to the typical format of the academic output for students in programs I have experienced. The written paper in this regard may not be conducive for the ways of knowing outside of Western mode. For research creation, and certainly with a nonlinear interactive documentary, their free range ability allows for expression that cannot be otherwise captured. I want to provide here just a trigger warning to the audience that this next slide presents a web documentary that discusses sexual violence. So I'll definitely wait a couple seconds for the folks who perhaps would like to step out. Tiffany Swings and Christopher Kang's The Space We Hold is a nonlinear documentary collection of stories of survivors who experienced and continue to experience military sexual violence. And I'll just play a few navigating pieces of it. In this piece, a mechanism for listening is guided by the amount of affect the viewer might experience. In order to hear the stories of the grandmothers, you must first keep your finger on the tab bar. Once you release it, you are prompted to either continue or end the segment. In this case, you are not forced to continue on, and the respect and care for the testimonials of the grandmothers is still central. The film also embeds the experience of those who could not continue on into the narrative, validating a halted viewing experience as well. In this piece, the multiple layers introduce care for its viewers and their own emotional labor and capacity to continue on. This, for me, might also exhibit a liminal space, inviting viewers into a world with cautious consideration. However, I would be remiss if I thought that nonlinear documentary and research creation were, as what community engaged art is often assumed to be, something that has to solve all the major systemic problems of the world.
Shanice, you have more or less 5 minutes left, but don't worry too much about it.
Thank you. Just maybe they do not have to be a meeting place at all. My thesis for my MA, Heritage, using Type 4 hair to reconcile struggles of race and identity through research creation, is a deeply intimate, nonlinear film that showcases task-based interviews with my grandmother, Carmelita, younger sister Savannah, father Brian, longtime hairdresser Tony, and friend Nicole. So here you can kind of see what a very minimal nonlinear interactive documentary might look like when it's in the building stages on the screen. I wanted to listen to the tales of my grandmother without constraints of time. I did not want to cut her off and direct too many questions. I wanted to let the culturally rooted historical oral history practice guide my piece. There is little background context provided in the film, and you are essentially peering into a moment in time, watching a close encounter between loved ones. As much has changed since I completed the project in 2019, the love and the familiar practice remains the same. Because the film lives online, it's currently unavailable to the public because I'm trying to reconfigure it yet again, the story can change. This was the most intrinsic method for me to explore the discrimination of my coily hair and messiness of maneuvering through the world as a mixed race individual, theoretically and experientially. So where do I go from here? Research creation is not only a method for dissemination, but a critical methodological intervention that allows for alternative epistemologies to rise to the forefront. Rather than a small component of a project, they become the guiding force. Moreover, nonlinear documentary allows for access points into history, past, present, and future, decentralizing one single narrative. Ultimately, this presentation is a reflexive piece that culminates a series of thoughts that I have had over the last few years that I hope will flourish into something more comprehensive in the future as my career is just beginning. Thank you very much to the organizers of this conference, to our chair, to you, my fellow panelists, and to you, the audience members. I look forward to your questions and feedback.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you, Shanice, a really, really great presentation. We'll hold off for the questions for now, and then I'm going to introduce the next speaker. Let me just pull up the bio real quickly. So I'll give the word in a moment to Steve Smith. Steve Smith is an emeritus professor of philosophy and religious studies at Millsaps College, and he's the author of Full History on the Meaningfulness of Shared Action, which came out with Bloomsbury in 2017. And he's also the author of the forthcoming book, Full Responsibility, on pragmatic, political, and other forms of action sharing, which is coming out this year with State University of New York Press. Okay, Steve, I'm going to give the floor to you. Do you want to share your screen, or are you just going to speak?
I have an upcoming moment to share my screen, but I think Shanice needs to stop sharing her screen.
Yes.
Based on, there we go.
Done.
Okay, here I am. Shall I start?
Sure, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I want to thank the heroic organizers of this conference for rescuing the conference and making our experience possible. I do have a very short film clip to show in due course, and every film clip is an adventure. If the audio doesn't come through, though, don't worry about that. That might not be crucial. So I want to speak about Jean-Luc Godard's long multi-part work, Histoire du Cinéma, which came out 1988 to 1998, which I think is of unique interest in considering how there could be cinematic access to historical understanding. A lot has been written about Histoire du Cinéma, but I don't feel that it has been sounded out yet from a philosophy of history perspective, at least not one like mine. So I wanted to rise to this challenge.
Sorry to interrupt you. Are you already sharing your screen, because we're not seeing it?
No, I'm going to do that when it's time for
great.
the clip,
Sorry.
and
Sorry
only then. Sorry, I misled you.
No, it's fine. Please go
on. Godard makes the very strong claim that a cinematically formed historical understanding is ultimate for us because cinema bears the civilizational mission of realizing what we are up to in this phase of our shared life. Histoire pursues this realization without depending on film's deceptive photographic realism either in the fashion of dramatic reenactments of the past or as a documentary exhibition of filmed past occurrences. Rather, it's an essay film composed of worked over film clips and art images, music selections, and a wide variety of written and spoken ideas about film and civilization. If Histoire is a serious contribution to historical understanding, as Godard claims, what standards are applicable to it and how are these standards met? I think a lot of people view Godard as a provocateur and perhaps blow off his claims that he is in there with the most serious historians and grappling with Western history and the Holocaust in particular. But I want to take him at his word and see in what ways and to what extent he satisfies reasonable standards of historical research and understanding. I'm going to argue that he does satisfy some conventional standards of historical understanding in this work, while also taking us into uncharted depths of historical realization. And that's the exciting part for me. So to start with some pretty commonsensical considerations, the most basic standard of historical relevance is simply evidence. And Histoire heaps up diverse pieces of evidence with considerable truth value, including film clips that show the interests and styles of various schools of cinema, and also illustrate how Henri Langlois' programming at the Cinémathèque Française fostered a very wide view of significant relationships among movies. Such pieces of evidence have irreducible historical value in themselves, even if Godard's primary aim is to discover additional meaning by juxtaposing them. We can regard Histoire as evidence of how the 20th century formed the mind of one of its leading filmmakers, Godard himself. Accepted historical evidence has the status of undeniability, and so serves the purpose of settling for the time being some part of what can be asserted or denied about the facts of the past that constitute unchangeable enabling and limiting conditions for present action. For example, thanks to Raoul Hilberg's research published in The Destruction of the European Jews, to cite just that landmark study, there are facts about the scale and administration of the Nazi extermination program that cannot reasonably be denied. This is a matter of great practical importance. With a work like Histoire, we get the undeniability, not only that certain actions were filmed, but also that there is a haunting impact of these images in the present. And it was an intense experience of being haunted that forced me to try to reckon with the epistemology, as you might say, of watching Godard's Histoire. But to see Histoire as evidence is only to see it as material for historical study. If it's possible to appreciate Godard or Histoire as an active contributor to the comprehension of history, other standards must come into play. One of these standards is insight. Beyond merely displaying significant traces of the past, does the film display a significant relationship among some of them, such as a pattern of repetition or variation or opposition? There are insight moments in Histoire that are almost inarguable and would be solid pieces in a conventional documentary. In one such moment, in part 3A, we see a sequence of trains leaving from occupied France for Germany in 1942. The first scene is a propaganda event of French movie stars heading for Germany for collaboration with a German film studio. The next shows a deportation of French Jews to German camps. Thus, we see how the German regime, perhaps like other regimes, exploits modern technology partly with distracting glitz for consumers and partly with the unheralded horror of a population policy. More typically, however, the insights in Histoire are speculative and have to be labeled possible insights. For example, Godard shows that George Stevens photographed gruesome sights at Nazi camps in 1945, and then 6 years later captured a profound happiness in Elizabeth Taylor in a scene in A Place in the Sun. He remarks, if George Stevens had not used the first 16mm color footage at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, Elizabeth Taylor would never have had her place in the sun. Here is my clip. And this is the flavor you will get of this work. Are you seeing it?
Not Yes, it's starting to share now.
Let's
Yes.
play it. You can see that a lot is going on there. But I want to concentrate on the cut between Montgomery Clift's head in Elizabeth Taylor's lap and the head of the victim in the camp that was photographed when George Stevens came there with the American troops in 1945. And we're on the subject of possible insights. It's an interesting possibility that a certain intensity in a post-war imagining of happiness can be attributed to wartime horror, to look at it one way. The possibility is evoked by a visual continuity between a camp victim's head and Montgomery Clift's head in Elizabeth Taylor's lap. Godard's cut is suggestive, but leaves the possibility dangling. The insight here will depend on the viewer's previous experience with Stevens films and many other things, and also, of course, on what the viewer is ready to think about. A possible insight, I suggest, is ideally undismissible, though not undeniable. Generally, a serious inquirer into some subject matter, X, must seek all possible insight into X and cannot properly disregard a possible insight if it's indeed thinkable. Not nonsense. Godard purposely takes us to the frontier of thinkability in some of his juxtapositions because he believes that non-obvious connections are the true target of worthwhile montage.
Sorry, Steve, sorry to interrupt you. I think maybe you have a paper or something that's touching the microphone. It's a bit difficult to hear.
Oh, that's possible. Is it better now?
Much better, thanks.
All right, should I go back over what I just did, or was it good
Yeah,
enough?
maybe just a few seconds, maybe. Just the last part.
The last part. Possible insight. The possible insight, as I'm thinking of it, is ideally undismissible, because anybody who is seriously investigating a subject matter and confronts a possible insight has to process that, has to consider it for maybe including it in the eventual full understanding of the subject matter. But it's not undeniable. It does not have the undeniability of a fact. That was my move at that point. And Godard is sort of playing a risky game by taking us to the very limit of what is thinkable as an insight in his montage. And he thinks that that's what cinema should be doing, is searching for non-obvious but very enlightening juxtaposition relationships of elements of meaning. Godard applies to film montage Walter Benjamin's messianic ideal of glimpsed historical truth, which interrupts the repressive continuity of official history. And he combines that with the surrealist poet Pierre Rivardi's poetic ideal of an image being strong when, quote, the association of two ideas is both distant and fitting. It's a risky approach. Godard could be transforming his materials into arbitrary building blocks for his film, as the decontextualizing that makes them interruptive and available for more distant associations can also deprive them of the original meaning that makes them haunting and important to work with. So there, you could say that Godard is sort of betraying his materials by his overly adventurous combinations of them. David Brancaleone, though, argues that Godard supports the original meaningfulness of the images he selects to work with by working them over so carefully. Godard himself says, quote, "I paid homage to image and sound, my duty or filial respects, as it were, to the images and sounds that came before me," end quote. A more inherently rigorous standard of historical understanding is judgment. Does the film draw a conclusion about the past that could be true? Judgmental utterances abound in Histoire. Even the statement about Ravensbrück and Elizabeth Taylor is in the form of a judgment, though it's obviously not a judgment in substance. A more proper example might be the statement in Part 3A that the only European filmmaking enterprise that resisted the influence of Hollywood was Italian neorealism. But Godard's judgments are experimental and sometimes playful. For example, he asserts in Part 4A that Alfred Hitchcock conquered the world, succeeding where Alexander the Great had failed. One can ask about any of Godard's judgmental quotations from authors, even the ones that seem intended to express his own guiding ideas, in what way or to what extent the film actually endorses these judgments. Here, the film's historical contribution could be considered weak for lack of any definite substantiation of a judgment as worth acceptance. A historical judgment that the film seems serious about is this: cinema failed in two ways. Cinema as a whole, the 20th century experiment of cinema or venture. It failed to achieve its potential as a powerful new means of thought because it got diverted into entertainments fixated on sex and violence, girls and guns, as Godard's slogan goes, and into political propaganda. And it failed to fulfill its mission as the witness of the times. Conspicuously, it went missing during the ultimate crime of the Holocaust. Godard says in Part 1B, quote, cinema inherited not only the rights of photography to show us our world, but above all, its duties. In an interview, he said, at the moment when cinema did not film the concentration camps, it totally failed in its duty. Well, these claims I think are very problematic as judgments. And here's my pushback. Except on utopian assumptions, it doesn't make sense to conclude that cinema failed to achieve its potential merely because it wasn't predominantly used for its most noble application. What medium of expression ever was? In fact, there have been some great movies, which is why it's plausible to claim that cinema has a great civilizational potential and why Histoire has the ambition that it does. And the idea that cinema failed in its documentary mission is faulty because, first, if it was supposed to prevent anything from happening that could not stand the public view, it would have been functioning as the tool of a global surveillance state. Not a good thing. Second, if it had observed the Holocaust atrocities, it would be horribly compromised as atrocity porn. And third, cinema did, after all, witness the Holocaust in appropriate ways after the war, starting with the film taken at the liberated camps and progressing through the thoughtful consideration of Night and Fog, serious imaginative experiments like Seven Beauties by Lena Wertmuller, and the interview encounters of Shoah by Claude Lanzmann. Besides, earlier films like The Rules of the Game, The Great Dictator, To Be and Not to Be, and Day of Wrath now speak to us tellingly of the Holocaust, or so their sampling in Histoire suggests. Godard is arguing that himself. But the documentary attention took too long, Godard told Serge Danet in 1988. He said, quote, I noticed after a certain number of years, they hadn't shown the concentration camps. They had talked about them generally, but not shown them. I became interested, undoubtedly because of my guilt, my social class, etc. But the camps, they were the first thing that should have been shown. They didn't want to see them, end quote. We can say that Godard's judgments of failure, the failure of cinema here, are expressions of a mood of disappointment. The mood is very understandable, but does it constitute an understanding? Isn't it the vulgarity and inhuman behavior that we're disappointed with rather than cinema as such, which, obviously in the experience of viewing Histoire, might very well be helping us to think better about these problems? It seems to me better to say that Histoire gets us to entertain a possible judgment on this point and gives us much to consider in connection with that possible judgment. As a result of the whole experience of the movie, what I've called the mood of disappointment might become something more settled and discussable than a mood, something that we want to say is in the realm of understanding. A raised consciousness set up for judgment of historical truth, following the distinction I made earlier, whereas insights are about noticeable, significant relationships judgments are about what is true of the situation.
Sorry, Steve,
Possible.
you have 5 minutes
Five.
left. Is that all right?
You say 5?
Yeah, 5, yeah.
I will speed up. No, that's
Yeah,
not a
don't worry
good thing.
Don't worry too much about the time. We just have 3 presentations in the panel, but yeah, try not to go too long, but please take your time.
I'm glad you say that. I will be within bounds.
It's always tricky to say that as a chair, but I'm gonna go for it, so please.
I fully respect your moderating. Possible judgments and setups for judgment, like possible insights, are undismissible in the context of serious inquiry, provided they are not too implausible and we are wary of their biases. Now we come to what I shall suggest is an ultimate standard of relevance, and that is realization. A realizer doesn't merely notice something interesting or draw a conclusion for which there are good grounds. A realization decides a subject's position in a situation, centering and aiming the subject toward a certain significant prospect. The evidence for the realizer has come together with the click of a lock closing. History, as realizandum, is, for the historically serious inquirer, the priority-taking form of historical truth. For example, someone says, I've come to realize that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that realization is going to qualify that person's understanding of everything that person subsequently confronts in historical experience. For the realizer, history as realization is fully undeniable, for denial would consist not merely of avoiding acknowledging something in the past, but of refusing to see one's own position as a participant in a larger continuing action. Ordinary experience continually produces realizations that are the foundation of our practical competence, as our perception and memory work together to establish the forms and changes of things in our existence. On top of this, our various forms of expression are venues for communicative and intellectual realizations. When I hear that tone come into your voice, I realize you mean business. When I read some pages of Wittgenstein, I realize there needn't be a single definition of game. Godard's bringing together of cinema and history can be seen as his intent occupation of an especially auspicious venue of realization, 20th century cinema, while aiming at one of the ultimate realizanda, namely an answer to what has been going on in modern civilization and how are we implicated. A necessary general caveat about realizations is that although each one is final in its moment, none is final absolutely. They change. You might realize you can't live without a person and later realize you can't live with that person. Or you might realize that you're involved in an intimate relationship and yet you don't really see where it's going yet. Realizations have to be regarded with caution as works in progress. But unlike the process of revising one's understanding while taking in new information, realizations impose a sort of tunnel vision. Everything must be seen in their light. It may be that Godard already feels inevitable connections and implications in the elements of Histoire because the click of their collective significance has occurred for him, whether earlier in viewing them or later in editing them. But he would more likely say that he is in quest of a realization, just like he likes to say cinema is in quest of montage, the true montage. And that the elements of his presentation belong together as things that seem to ask for membership in a realization, magnetically attracted, as it were, rather than welded together. What he has is not the firm conviction of realization gained, but the compelling suspicion of a realization within reach. He could have a negative realization that we do not yet understand something that we do realize is essentially important to us. History would be like a murder mystery with World War II or the Holocaust in the role of the murder. Something terrible has definitely happened, implying that something fearful still threatens us. Now, it's far from clear that there is a single large thing like the murder in history, that Western civilization failed or cinema failed, for instance, but it's certain that there have been shocking actual murders. There's no question, thus, that we ought to be trying to understand how they happened and how we're implicated. If we feel the possibility and need of a realization, but are not sure what it will be, then the target is still indefinite. The name of the great realizandum for Godard in this project is history. But what does he suppose the realization of history would have in its grasp? Clearly, history is not the same thing as the sum of actions that have been filmed, even if film has a unique power in recording physical actions and maintaining their visibility for our contemplation. For the argument of Histoire, the crux of both history and cinema is what was not filmed, the Holocaust. As a general correction for what is left out of any particular collection of historical elements, it's easy to say, as Godard once said, history is the work of works, the whole lot. But history as understood would not merely be an indication of all that was done up to the present moment, the filmed and the unfilmed. It would preeminently consist of the significance of what was done, always still to be elaborated and negotiated among ourselves. Make that the paramount significance of what was done, as that continues to haunt our minds and our discussions. 2 minutes. Thus, inquiry is demanded not only into discernible occurrences and their causes, but also into our own apprehensions of significance. Projecting Histoire to an audience provides a platform for further discovery of such significance, a framing of the endeavor by a present recognition that we, the viewers, are invested in this cinematographic assembly. And here I think Godard would be wanting to interface with the kinds of, with the considerations that Shanice was bringing up about the community collaborating on historical realization. Accepting the premise of an active quest for realization rather than an achieved realization relieves Godard of some objections to his project. He's not imposing his own idea on us. He's confronting us with significant traces of shared experience that draw us toward realizations. With possible realizations, we're again in the realm of the ideally undismissable, provided there are compelling reasons to pursue a realization, as we have in a murder case, and provided that the suggestions toward a convincing solution are not frivolous or insane. As the surrealist poet said, the distant connection must also be fitting. To conclude, the highest standard of historical implication that Godard's work meets is not undeniability, I argue, but undismissibility. Godard's seriousness about inhumanity serves as the glue holding the project together. His facility for incorporating fascinating and resonant visual material is the magnetism binding the audience to the presentation. And his playfulness in stating theses gives the work a redeeming looseness of grip, so that our interpretation of history is more empowered than imposed, more launched than capped off. I find the experience of watching Histoire so distinctively stirring that I want to say many viewers will say this work is not only ideally undismissible, it's essential. Many viewers will realize that their own life of historical inquiry is now inseparable from Godardian experience. Not necessarily the specific montage of Histoire, but the kind of thing it is and the guiding concerns it has. You will have been enrolled in a philosophy of history and cinema that demands a politically and aesthetically sensitive search for possible insights, judgments, and realizations concerning what has really been going on in our shared life. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the Q&A on that one as well. I'm gonna quickly go to you, Maria, and introduce you, and then we can do your presentation. And I suppose, yeah, the cat is out of the box now. 20 minutes, but you can go a little bit over if you need. So Maria Deldén, I hope I pronounced that right, or Deldén? Deldén? Okay, great. So Maria Deldén is a researcher and senior lecturer in educational work and history didactics at Dalarna University in Sweden. She has a long-standing teaching experience both at high school and university. Her research is empirically and theoretically oriented towards history didactics and towards learning and meaning-making in education in the broad sense. She is currently involved in a classroom research project that examines students' identity-forming processes in history and social science classrooms, and she has just finished a participatory research project together with an ID-driven organization in Colombia on learning in non-formal environments and on the possible implications of this for formal education. And Deldén is also a co-author of the report, Education for Sustainable Development in Courses in Teacher Education at the aforementioned Dalarna University, which came out in 2021, last year. Okay, Maria, I'm gonna give the floor to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for the opportunity to present in this conference. I will now share my screen. So, is this the presentation mode that you are seeing?
We're seeing it, yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. And
excuse me. Sorry. I think maybe
yeah.
you have to press the presentation button because I'm seeing it on my screen, but not on the one behind me. Or you can press F5.
So,
I think it's F5 on PowerPoint.
Okay. No.
Is that okay? Is that okay? Yes.
Is it
maybe we
okay?
should just try because some people enter the room and if you go to with your mouse on the right bottom corner, you see the sign for the presentation. Yes. If you click on that one,
Yeah.
I think it should work.
I did.
Nothing's happening.
No.
So you're not in are you in presentation mode at where you are right now?
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah.
So,
And if you try to go to, can you just try quickly to go through the slides so we can see if that works for us?
yeah,
Please?
I'm at the slides now.
Yeah, that works.
So it's better like this.
Okay. Yeah, don't worry about
But
it. You can. Okay, everybody can see the slides on Zoom. That's already great. You know what? Please just go ahead and start. I'll try to tinker with Zoom in the meantime to see if I can project it behind me so that the audience can also see it. It's sitting in the back. But sorry for that. So most of the people can't see the slides, so I'll just be working on that. And please just go ahead.
So,
sorry about that.
So I can have this mode.
Oh, they magically appeared. Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
It's magic. It's
It's magic.
So sorry for
Okay.
that.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Let's go on with the magic. Okay. So I will be talking about. I will share my thoughts on the notion of historical empathy and feature film in history education. And I start with a quote. Because this quote sets the context for the research problem in question. We have to further collective memory studies by focusing on the communication among memory makers.
Sorry to interrupt you again. We don't see the slides moving.
Ah, you don't?
No.
And why is this? So if I stop share and then I share again. Now.
Wow, yes.
Now you see them
behind me.
Now you see them move?
Yes,
I
okay. Maybe they will, yeah, okay. Wow, finally. Yes, sorry about all of that, but we do have some time to spare, so that's good. Please go ahead.
Technology is tricky, always. Okay. We have to further collective memory studies by focusing on the communications among memory makers, memory users, and the visual and discursive objects and traditions of representation. This hermeneutic triangle implies an open dialogue between the object, the maker, and the consumer in constructing meaning, quoted from Quint in Kahnsteiner. What do I want to talk about going from this? I want to enter an educational situation where feature film is used with specific aims and where students make meaning and where historical empathy is at play and where memory and history are intertwined. There is a dispute in history research how historical empathy should be defined and what role it should play in history education. The main disagreement lies in how to understand the affected dimensions of historical meaning making, where one standpoint is that historical empathy is namely about cognitive processes to understand the past from its own premises. That is, to recognize and understand past meanings. The other standpoint, the other standpoint embraces both cognitive and emotional aspects of understanding history and sees a connection between interpretations of historical sources and experiences in the present. Here, both perspective recognition and empathy as caring are important aspects. And historical empathy is seen rather as a process in understanding rather than an achievement. Both standpoints, however, underline the importance of contextualization, that is, the recognition of interpretation of historical evidence in relation to the historical time. This paper sympathizes with the second standpoint described above, but wants to explore this further with help from Christopher Blake in his criticism of how historical empathy have been defined. Blake introduces the concept of empathy in history instead of historical empathy. By doing this, he visualizes that it is precisely in the relation between questions to the past and questions to the present that people give meaning to their lives here and now. And I'm quoting Blake. In short, we need to know as much about where we start from as we do about where we aim to go. Such an outlook requires a dialectic between the present and past, one in which the complexities of here and now are dealt with by historians as rigorously and investigatively as in the past. Empathy can be a critical component of such an investigation, end quote. So Blake puts emphasis in the understanding of empathy in itself related to history and other disciplines. He points out that by trying to define empathy and historical empathy as something different from empathy in other disciplines, we miss the whole register of the notion of empathy, which are identification, imagination, and sympathy. By embracing the very notion of empathy and connect it to history and historical knowledge, we can reach a more interdisciplinary approach that reveals more layers of historical understanding. So how can we then understand historical understanding and empathy related to historical feature film? How is it relevant for a fictional telling of the past? On the one hand, there is a criticism towards the use of historical feature film as a source for historical understanding, since fictional storytelling never can be counted as reliable historiography. But on the other hand, several historians recognize the historical feature film not only as a primary source, but also as a historical source that can produce historical knowledge, even if the fictional narrative contains facts that are not historically accurate. In this perspective, the affective dimensions of historical feature film are important. And here is a link to empathy in history and perspective recognition. There is a tension expressed in previous research. The tension is about, this is about educational tension between students' ability to recognize perspectives and contextualize the understanding of past events, and students' need to empathize with people in the past, engaging in strong feelings belonging in the present. And from this, I formulate the aim. And the aim of the paper is to explore the concept of historical empathy by using the metaphor go visiting from Hannah Arendt, and with historical feature film as the educational arena. And the paper has an exploratory theoretical approach and with special focus on students' meaning making. Therefore, empirical material in the form of students' voices and film narration is used both to illustrate and challenge the theoretical perspective. So I turn to Arendt and her metaphor, go visiting. Arendt describes human becoming into the world in the sense of political subjects and unique beings. She uses the word natality. Who we become is conditioned by the world already existing when we are born, and into which we start to weave our threads of life. And thereby we contribute with something new. This condition of natality consists of the double figure of having to interact with the world already existing, and by acting and speaking, we contribute to the world. In this way, the human being by existing relates to the past, the present, and the future at the same time. Speaking as well as acting are expressions of will, and by expressing a will, we become political subjects. Arendt also puts a perspective of plurality on humans' interaction in and with the world. It is important that we act and react with others with curiosity of everyone's uniqueness. To visit the life experiences of someone else is not only a way to understand others, but also a way to understand one's own standpoints. Personal growth, therefore, presupposes plurality and the awareness of precisely the space in between persons or groups that go visiting. So plurality is a condition for humans to enable enlarged thought, and it is a necessary condition for a functioning democracy. Plurality is a recognition of the threads in one's own life as well as of the threads in the lives of others. And plurality is a necessity to get to know yourself as a unique being. Regarding the visiting metaphor, I want to underline that those who go to visit do it as themselves and from the standpoint of themselves. They familiarize with other people's experiences. With the help of our imagination, we can visit other people's possible thoughts and value judgments. Through this experience, our own thoughts and value judgment can be subjected to criticism, and thus we can reach an expanded thinking. Closely connected to the metaphor go visiting is the notion of in-between. Arendt describes the in-between parting from the word interest. The two parts, inter and est, puts focus on the in-between. When we speak and act with each other, and I quote Dish, it is an agreed purpose which varies with each group of people and serves to relate and bind them together. So when we speak and act in the world, we share a common space with the person or group we are communicating with. This common space both links and separates the individuals and groups communicating. It is not about shared identities or shared qualities in each of the individual or group, but rather about the shared space. This space is twofolded. It comprises a worldly objective side, and at the same time, this space in between is a system of relations between human beings. In this way, plurality is manifested in the sense that we share the fact that we always will experience the same object, but from different perspectives, thus binding us together and separating us. Carsten Ljunggren, he wrote in 2009 an article called Agonistic Recognition in Education on Arendt's qualification of political and moral meaning. And I quote him to summarize. This is about the capacity to represent to oneself a variety of viewpoints in order to be sensitive to different kinds of political and moral situation. And it is, quoting Ljunggren, agonistic recognition of myself. So, turning to the student and their voices to further explore the historical empathy. I will come to Peter's experience, but first something about the material. The empirical material used here is twofolded. The first material consists of interviews with upper secondary students during 2012 and 2013. I interviewed 12 students about their experiences of historical feature film in the history classroom related to their historical meaning making. The interviews were performed shortly after the students had seen the films. And during the interviews, the students were asked to pick one or two scenes that had made impact on them, and we saw these scenes together while the students shared their thoughts and feelings with me. A content analysis inspired by phenomenology of the interview transcripts were undertaken. The analysis showed interesting results concerning the concept of historical empathy. And for this paper, 2 empirical examples of students' expressions related to historical empathy were selected to illustrate and to contribute to the theoretical exploration of the concept. And the second material consists of the film narrations that the students from the interviews were watching during history class. And the films are Hotel Rwanda and Letters from Iwo Jima. And the film's narratives were analyzed with a focus on the parts that had been mentioned from the students in the interviews. So, Peter's experience. I now turn to Peter, who experienced the film Hotel Rwanda. And he chose a sequence where the protagonist, Paul Rusesabagina, and his employee, Grégoire, are out on a mission. They are on their way home to the hotel where Paul has given refuge to persons from the Tutsi population who are victims in the Rwandan civil war in the 1990s. In the film scene, it is foggy and hard to see the road. Paul is driving and Grégoire is in the passenger seat. The road is shrouded in fog and the car shakes and jumps. Paul stops the car and gets out. As he gets out of the car, he falls and he sees what has caused the unpleasant ride, dead bodies. Paul gets up on his feet and sees many more dead people along the way. The camera follows Paul's gaze as it wanders over the corpses. The scene is filmed in such a way that the viewer can grasp the information together with Paul. The camera is alternately positioned so that the viewer sees Paul and what Paul sees. When the viewer sees what Paul sees, subjective point of view shots are used so that a sense of sharing the film characters' experiences arises. Slowly it lights up in the film scene as the day begins. This happens as Paul and Grégoire understand what they are seeing. Peter describes what he sees and how he understands it. It was there when they went and fetched goods because they had no food. And then they would come back and then it is foggy and so they see nothing and so everything starts to bounce. Then they get out of the car and then the fog lightens and then they see that there are bodies everywhere. It evokes very strong emotions. And also to see Paul and how he reacts, that he becomes very scared and anxious. And then when he comes back to the hotel, he just goes into a room alone and breaks down and refuses to meet people. And since Paul in the film has appeared like a strong person who doesn't get sad so easily, and then he gets so sad, then it really feels like it is extreme, and that makes me sad. In the case of Peter, an interpretation of the interview shows that the visit through the film's narration to Paul Rusesabagina's life experiences as shown in the film helped Peter to deepen his historical understanding of the civil war in Rwanda and of the Western world's reactions, not only through the film narration, but also with help from other historical sources. The visit to Paul Rusesabagina's life world put Peter in relation not only to Paul's life world, but to himself. Peter asked questions about responsibility from various perspectives, also from his own. He also expresses that even if the emotional reaction is strong and evokes feelings of guilt in him, he can understand the difference between himself and his reactions and Paul's feelings in the past, as narrated in the film. They are not the same, but with imagination, he can understand something about the civil war in Rwanda and about his own reaction that he had not experienced before. This is an important aspect of empathy in history, to avoid an identification, because it is impossible to really fully identify with another human being. The film narration, if analyzed properly, could help the viewer to identify different perspectives and also identify the spaces in between these perspectives. This exemplary validity of history can open for more complexity in historical meaning making, and it invites the viewer to critical thinking towards perspective recognition and empathy in history education. And I want to give another example, and we turn to James. And James can help us to concrete how the notion of the in-between can deepen the understanding of empathy and history. He saw the film Letters from Iwo Jima and was emotionally and cognitively engaged in the story, portraying the Japanese soldier Saigo from a Japanese perspective of the US conquest of the Japanese island Iwo Jima during the World War II. James' experience of Letters from Iwo Jima highlight how the film's violent narration of the Battle of the Island affects his understanding of war. He says, but it was understood in the film that the war was not a good thing. It was kind of dangerous there, and you did not want to be there really, because nobody wants to be at war, even if people try to make it sound good. The specific shift between experiences of empathy and antipathy that the film elicits in James may have helped him to understand that this was not a film that focused the usual genre pattern for war movies. The film was not one of those, as James describes it, where the hero survives everything and shoots down as many as possible without being killed himself. This is a film that tries to show what war really is. Just because Letters from Iwo Jima does not follow the traditional genre pattern of war movies, as James sees it, it emotionally seizes him in a way that makes him understand war in a way he has not done before. He describes how the film depicts ordinary people who just want to live their lives. They do not want to be at war. He also expresses that there is a romanticized description of war in other films that this film does not accept. It is, among other things, the film's portrayal of Saigo that causes James to ponder his own understanding of the situation of the Japanese during the World War II. The film's structure of storytelling contributes to this. The viewer gets to know Saigo partly through the depictions of the island of Iwo Jima and the battle, and partly through letters he writes home. In the experience of the film, proximity and distance are mixed, which means that the viewer gets to shift between proximity and distance in the empathy with Saigo, in the antipathy to the violence, and in the interpretation of what war really means. The proximity to Saigo lies in allowing the viewer to share the horrors and consequences of the war with him in the letters writing. But just as the letters express proximity, they also signal distance. Saigo is distant from everything that matters to him. He cannot be with those he loves, and the letters become a symbol of this distance. And James says, and then I was a
Very
little
sorry.
sad that they didn't want to be. Yeah?
Sorry, do you think it's possible to
Yeah?
round off in like 5 minutes?
Yes, I will. And then I was a little sad that they didn't want to be there. They are forced there. They have to leave their wives and children at home, and they know that their men will die, all of them, and they accept it all, and they accept it anyway. So it was a little sad. James describes that the film's ability to illustrate the individual's vulnerability in wars give him a sense of greater understanding of people in the past. They were people of flesh and blood, just like we who live here and now. When he read about the battle before he saw the film, he had not realized that behind the numbers of dead were real people. The film narration helps James to reflect on how the individual human beings is influenced by historical events and how the personal history is interwoven with history in a bigger perspective. A form of self-understanding and motion can be the result, because by being challenged in his view of others, James is given the opportunity to reflect on how his identity is shaped in relation to others here and now. This also points to an understanding of the world related to both time and space, as James' image of the war as phenomenon changes with the experiences of Letters from Iwo Jima. So, go visiting implicates the possibility to think one's own thoughts, but from the place of somebody else. In relation to film reception, it represents a position where individuals' understanding through historical feature film encompasses both an historical position as well as a position of personal reflection in the present. This oscillation between distance and nearness can enable enlarged thought, but this depends on how historical feature film's narration facilitates or obscures a conscious position of the viewer, referring to Landsberg. A development of individuals' historical's understanding through feature film highlights the importance of the space in between the past and the present, in between humans and in between the student, the film narration, and the subject of history. This space connected to the mediation of history through feature film also encompasses a rethinking of the notion of historical empathy towards a critical method of intersubjectivity in historical process, in line with Blake, or in line with the agonistic recognition of oneself in education, according to Ljunggren. This is an important element for historical understanding because of the limits that historical culture puts on our possibilities to fully understand the past. The awareness of precisely the space in between and the importance of the interest, as Arendt puts it, is a theoretical key to further understand empathy in history when history is mediated through film narration. So, the metaphor Go Visiting makes it possible to shift from either empathizing with the past or the present when trying to understand the concept of historical empathy. It puts focus on the in-between and makes it clearer that we are dealing with empathy in history in a continuum of time, rather than historical empathy as empathy in relation to a specific historical time. And empathy in history may offer a lens to embrace all elements in the hermeneutic triangle, the maker, the user, the representation, in constructing meaning in and over time. And finally, I propose an acceptance of the tension described in earlier research as both a condition and an asset for historical understanding. The tension may be seen not as a tension, but rather as an entanglement between theory and practice, between the methodology and theory with the historical discipline, within the historical discipline, and the historical meaning making in everyday life. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. Great presentation. All right, I think we have a half hour, a little bit more for Q&A. Yes, I already see one question. I think we'll take just one question at a time, so please go ahead.
Yes, can I,
Can you hear her, or
I can go,
no?
I can go.
Yeah, please, or you can just sit here if you want. It's
Yeah, just to be more comfortable. So they won't see the
Oh yeah,
empty-
there is actually
empty.
a mobile microphone, but please sit here. It's fine. If you yeah, I can turn the. No, I cannot. Anyway, they can see you.
They are listening? Yeah, they are listening. Hi. Oh, I would like to congratulate all the panelists, and I have, my name is Ana Maria Mauad. I am a professor from Brazil, and I've been working with visual culture, and I'd like to make a question for each one of the panelists. I will start by Shani. Shani, I thought your work just very, very interesting, and it has a lot to do with what we've been doing in our group of research. So we can later change emails and contacts. And I'm happy that from the beginning you have a lot of important questions to be developed. But I have I'd like to give you the opportunity to talk about 2 points of your presentation. The first point, I would like to understand, you valorized it, in your presentation, the dimension of the format of the non-linear documentary. But I would like you to bring the discussion about the content of the documentary. How the content is taken into account in the collaborative work. I've been working with the idea that the public historian Michael Frisch, the oral historian Michael Frisch, developed in the Dalarna University his shared authority or sharing authority. That is very, very interesting in the way we've been working with the communities of ex-slaveries and in Brazil, and also indigenous people, and also with documentary too. So this is the first one. And the other one has to do with your theoretical basis. And my discussion is how the format of the documentary has to do with the way the an anti-colonial narrative can be developed. So I would like to listen a little bit more the theoretical frame you were claiming for your work, because I think it's very interesting. So I congratulate you. Stephen, I love your presentation. It's very, very interesting. But I have, actually, it's not a question, but a provocative affirmation, anyway. I think we can think about the project of Histoire of Godard from two aspects. The first aspect, the first entry, has to do with art history, has to do with the way Godard relates to the history of art and the way he deals with the cinema as art. And I think I have a suspicion, it's not a hypothesis, it's a suspicion, that Godard is discussing very closely with the line of research in art history of A.B. Warburg. Especially when you projected the image, it's very interesting for me how he used to pose this anachronist encounter. So it reminds me, it recalls me the series of images that create the minimalism map for Warburg. So I think this articulation of anachronist for Godard has a lot to do with Warburg calls the pathos morphal, that has to do with the affection. He needs to affect the people. He needs to take the audience from this comfortable place. So I think this is the way he works. It's suspicious. I would like to hear you. And the other one is the way he is committed to a cause. So film is a revolutionary tool. You cannot, you need to go out from the cinema and destroy the city, and destroy. You need to react. You cannot just play as a military in a battle. You need to be affected. And that's why he thinks film failed in put people in movement, in reaction, and engaged to a cause, committed to a cause, because he is doing cinema in a very, very important moment of history where they have a lot of to do with this revolutionary project. You see other kinds of filmography in South America, and you can understand a little bit more this attitude. It's also a provocative thinking. And Maria, I love your work. I think it's so important to have this kind of experience, and the idea of empathy for me is great. I've been developing the notion of historian attitude. So everyone can develop a historical consciousness when it is affected, when he or she is affected by empathy. So I agree with your arguments, and I think your reading of Hannah Arendt is very interesting. But I have a few methodological questions. I think your work would be for your work to be more clear. The first question is, you show the movies as a special project, or the students has already know, or it's a part of a program when the movie enters, so they already know about the Second World War, and they already know about Africa, and they are invited to see the movie. Because I think there is a difference between going to the movies, and being affected by them, and being introduced into a film in a pedagogical situation with information, previous information that you are expecting, and you create this expectation. I think it has to do with the conditions of becoming an audience and the competence you have to deal with these conditions. And the second question is more objective. I would like to know how old is Peter and how old is Jane? Because I think it makes a lot of difference. Thank you again, and thank you, Rafael.
Thank you for those questions, Anna. Really, really great stuff. I guess you're kind of discussant, so that's great. I think we should take them in reverse order. So, Anna, if you want to sit here, it's also fine,
yeah.
as you prefer. As you prefer. Shanice, can you go first?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Mawad, for your question. And I really appreciated your plenary session yesterday, as I am passionate about family photography, and I will be presenting on it at the Canadian Communication Conference in a couple of weeks related to the landscape of Canada and Black identities. So thank you so much for your work, and I really do hope we can connect. You asked me some large questions, which I hope I can do justice in this moment, but I definitely will consider as I continue on this journey. So for the first question in relation to content, I think this was something that I struggled with, specifically trying to find appropriate examples for this presentation, because the ones that I ended up choosing, I felt provided bite-sized information, but weren't exactly the ones I wanted to present in the robust form. So for example, in relation to perhaps The Space We Hold, which is one of the last ones we saw, one of the reasons for why I felt that that film was really kind of emblematic of having a kind of terrain that is problematic and also kind of complicated and messy is because in the coding of it itself, and because of the content being so fraught with affect, having that kind of space bar to kind of take the viewer out, put them back in, and then embedding in it viewer experience as well. So I thought that because of the fact that we're not dismissing perhaps the experience of the grandmothers, but validating and knowing that this is something that might be really difficult for folks to watch, especially survivors who may have fallen upon this piece, but also the fact that they can pick it up and come back to it at another point. So I think that that care was really something that I appreciated, and I do know that that was part of the code. There are a few films that I didn't bring in, which are The Shoreline Project by Dr. Liz Miller, who's also at Concordia. And this piece was actually created alongside community and students, and is a larger, more expansive map than my own thesis that actually was provided to different communities to work on and then collectively construct different pieces. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting about that film, which I can definitely send a link to anyone who's interested, is the fact that there really is no linear narrative, and it's related to the BC shoreline, specifically in Vancouver, and how the water line is increasing. And so you see several different communities, a lot of the time Indigenous communities of specific areas, discussing that change as a result of kind of settler colonialism and the expansion of not only like green spaces, but then also heavily influenced by real estate that is incredibly skyrocketing, and it continues to do so. So I think that the content kind of drives the way the nonlinear documentary ends up becoming. In relation to Roxham Road, you see that we're in this really dark and orange and also gray territory that we don't really understand, which most likely is something that the experiences of the refugees who are crossing is similar. Obviously, it might be lush with greenery and things like that, but that feeling of being in this abyss, not knowing what is forward and what is behind, I think is something that is really well represented in that piece. And not only that, you're also presented with narratives and also can click through articles as well. So there are other parts of the nonlinear documentary that we didn't see in my presentation that are text-based. There's also in Supreme Law course material from grade 7 to grade 12. So I think that they're really conducive for that. Your second question is something that I really struggle with, and I think in relation to specifically how nonlinear documentary can kind of have an anti-colonial perspective. I think not so much nonlinear documentary, but research creation as a whole. So using research creation not as something that is just a method for informing your research, but bringing together queer theory, critical disability studies, Indigenous studies, and so many other perspectives into the fold that drives the leading force of your research. And also knowing that you could end up somewhere, which, I mean, arguably with any research, you can end up somewhere you didn't expect you'd begin. But through the experience myself, I still feel as though the project is unfinished, but also was developed into what it should be based on how me as a researcher, but then also someone who comes from specific categories and also histories felt represented my family and represented our histories and our lineage. So I think that I'm struggling with this because research creation at my current institution isn't something that is part of the forefront and isn't something that is offered to students. But I think that there's definitely should be a move to incorporating some of those aspects into allowing students who perhaps, not because they're incapable of writing the format of a paper or things like that, but because perhaps that expression is not at all conducive to their own worldviews and also like life and how they were raised. So I do hope that those kind of scratch the surface of your questions, but I'll definitely continue to hold them in tension with my work. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Shanice. Steve, do you want to answer the questions next?
Thanks. Excuse me. Thanks for the comments, Professor Moad. The reference to Warburg is very relevant. I'm not aware that Godard ever refers to the Warburg project, but he does refer a lot to André Malraux's Musée Imaginaire, which is comparable. And so I think the rationale for what Histoire accomplishes is related to the rationale for whatever whatever a Musée Imaginaire can accomplish. And of course, this is a fundamental interest for the whole concept of museums in general and the whole concept of creating public experiences of new meanings from repositioned historical elements. On the revolutionary point, I think it's too good. You know, Godard has created a movie that is, in the end, it's an art house experience. It's going to be experienced by people like me who will get it on DVD, but he put a lot of effort into making it a genuinely public and collaborative experience of shared inquiry. And a lot has been written by him and his supporters and critics about the projection aspect of film, you know, the way in which a film event gathers an audience to confront something together, and in principle to make an event that can start new practical adjustments in life. And one example of how he sort of started, he lit a revolutionary fuse in his work. Not so much in Histoire, but more in later works. He connected the Holocaust to the Palestinian issue in Israel, under occupation in Israel, and he has gotten a lot of pushback about that. You know, connecting the Musulman persona of the Holocaust victim to the Muslim victim of Israeli occupation. So he himself is very practical in his filmmaking as regards confronting issues of injustice as he sees them and issues of civilization failure in the world we are actually in. I'll just note that.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Maria, do you want to go next?
Thank you, and thank you so much for the questions. I'm happy to hear that you are also in empathy and the importance of empathy in history. And I also want to thank you for your presentation yesterday. It was very interesting. The questions you gave me, I did not put emphasis on the methodology in the presentation. So I'm happy that you ask for that. The context, and this is interesting to think a little bit more about. They see the students, they are upper secondary students, so they are about 17 years old. And I followed two different educational projects. In this project where they saw these two films, the students themselves choose the films they saw, and they were given how do you say it in English? Una tarea.
Puedes hablar en español.
Yes, sí, mucho mejor para mí. Una tarea, an assignment from the teachers, and they the assignment was that they should analyze a specific event in history through historical feature film, through a fictional novel, and from historical facts. And they were supposed to study these three different sources and compare them, and make an oral presentation for their fellow classmates for about 15 minutes. It was a rather extent work. So the film is in a context of other sources, but it is also in the context of measurement, and in the context of achieving something to please the educational situation, so they can get their grade. And this is when you do this type of research in history classroom, you always deal with the situation that the students are not completely freely watching a movie. But in this case, I wanted to do the interview shortly after they had seen the film, and I wanted to be assured that they hadn't done the other work before they saw the film. So I wanted the not a pure reaction, because that is not possible, but I wanted to be in the beginning of their thinking and feeling about the film. And then I did a second interview after they had completed the work, and this is not in this presentation. So this is it's tricky because when you try to understand historical empathy, and when I now is trying to do it with help from Arendt's The In-Between, there is also an in-between between the student and the subject of history, and the demands that the subject puts on the student, and that is intertwined with in between the student and the fictional narration of the film. So this is
How old were them?
17. They were 17.
So teenagers.
Yeah. What else?
If I may chip in,
Thank you.
because I think my question directly relates to what you were saying, Maria. Then I also have a question for Shanice, but I'll ask it to you first, Maria. So I was wondering, on the methodological perspective, if you considered focus groups instead of interviews. And I'm asking that because I was wondering, you obviously look at classroom dynamics, so that makes a lot of sense. But if you could reflect a little bit more on the differences in terms of experiencing the empathy, if students would watch them, for instance, at home by themselves, and what does that say about experiencing movies like Hotel Rwanda in a classroom together? If you could speak a little bit more about that, because I'm sure that has a lot of influence on the please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Because in this class, they saw the films at home because they had choose different films, and that's why it makes it interesting, because I get that, and I didn't want to make focus group interviews with these students because I wanted to sit with them, and I wanted to have a lot of time, the time that was needed to talk about the film. And I also wanted to be in the film experience with the students. So that's why I asked them to pick a scene so that we could so that we could see. We talked about the whole film, but I wanted to understand how the thinking and feeling was operating in the students. And one of the results of of because this part that I'm doing now on historical empathy is just a small part of my PhD project that I finished 4 years ago. So now I'm going back to my material to search for, because the project left me with a lot of questions on, for example, historical empathy. So I want to explore that further. What I saw, what I understood when I heard the student and when I analyzed the material was that there are sequences of thinking and feeling that are connected to each other, and there you cannot separate the experience that the students make. You cannot separate thinking and feeling from each other, because one thing leads to another. And I don't think I could have got that in the same way with focus group interviews, because I wanted to have this in-depth interview with each one of the students. And in the other group that is not in this paper, they saw Schindler's List, and they saw the film together in the classroom. And you are quite right here, Rafael, because they in the interviews afterward, they told me that because they were in the classroom, they were not able to express what they felt. They wanted to cry, but they did not cry. They wanted to turn off the film to take a pause, but they could not. So this too raises questions about what happens when we experience film together in a situation where there is an achievement connected to the experience. Yeah, I'm sorry for my English.
No, it's completely fine.
Perfect.
Yeah, completely follow.
Better than mine.
So did you raise your hand? Okay, yeah, I think we can have a microphone, so before,
No, he can sit here.
if you prefer to sit here, yeah. It's a bit unorthodox. I think we actually have
It would be nice,
microphone
because
for-
then we can see him.
Yeah, exactly. Please, yeah.
I'm Michihiro Okamoto, Emeritus Professor of Toyo University in Japan. I'm now organizing Public History Association of Japan, and so I'm interested very much in film and history. My question is two. The first is the differences of the recognition of the past between those who have not watched films, that is, the before 19th century people, and those who lived after the 20th century, after film was made and consumed. They are very different. They are very different. The former consider the past completely different from the present. But the latter is likely to consider the past and the present similar. And my second question is the problem of empathy. The strength of films is that encourages empathy among the people. It's affirmative. But the problem is that people tend to think the past similar to the present as the actors and actresses who are popular actor. Who acts the characters as the real persons in the past, though they are really quite, though they live in the present, and so they are really quite different from the characters they act. Okay.
Thank you. Is that addressed to a specific presenter or?
All of them.
All of them. Okay, so who wants to chip in? Who wants to answer the question first? Or did you? Yeah.
I think I can definitely chime in on one point, just because I feel like the questions maybe were not as applicable to my project and paper, but I do think your point specifically about the experience of film for different generations, if I was understanding correctly, is something that I'm thinking about too, just in relation to some of the subjects who were on screen for, I'm going to go back to the same one, The Space We Hold. So thinking about individuals who take part and collaborate in pieces, but if, for instance, the grandmothers who perhaps maybe don't interact with film in the same way, I'm assuming here, but I feel as though it's possible that I'm not sure if they've run through the entire film themselves without someone else, which means that this film, while it is intended to kind of showcase and create this kind of empathetic space, doesn't really acknowledge the fact that the collaborators and then also the primary individuals whose stories are showcased, it isn't exactly something that they can benefit from immediately. So it's almost like that benefit is kind of lost in using the format of like a nonlinear documentary, depending on the subjects. And well, I don't like using subjects, but the topic at hand is something that I can chime in with if that applies.
Maybe I could say something as well. I agree that there is a problem that we maybe tend to think that we understand people of the past, and when we really don't know because we don't meet them. And the past is mediated to us through the layers of stories that has been told during the time since the past. So we really, but my point here is that in history education, when we try to work with conceptualization in the history classroom, thinking that we are searching for the most reasonable interpretations of the past events without taking notice of the present, thinking that we are doing something historically accurate, then we are missing that inevitably we are using ourselves when we do these interpretations. And the point with empathy in history that is like gliding through all times between the past and the present makes us conscious about the historical interpretations that we always make. And and we make the students aware of their own thoughts and feelings when they are doing these interpretations, as well as others during during the time where history has been written also has done that.
Thank you. Thank you for Steve, do you want to? Yeah, please.
I would just add that watching Godard's work, Histoire du Cinéma, is a very rich experience of empathizing and reflecting on empathy, because you're constantly looking at these clips of narrative films that had guns and girls and, you know, Hollywood plots, and at one level you cannot stop yourself from getting on board with those stories the way they were originally presented, and caring, you know, in the prescribed, you know, Hollywood-ish ways. But also you have another level experience of, oh my gosh, you know, how awful it is that Jennifer Jones has to play a character that keeps shooting at Gregory Peck and gritting her teeth and climbing up this gritty hillside, and then you look at yourself having that reaction. You, oh, what have I been going through that I've been a prisoner of these plots, and you know, so I don't think it's ultimately confusing like a hall of mirrors. It's more like a very articulated Brechtian distanciation from naive empathy that still works with all the levels of empathy that one is capable of feeling, which is that's a big part of the profundity of the experience for me.
Thank you. Thank you. Does it answer your question?
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I had a question, Shanice. I also really liked your presentation, and you know, I don't know if bravery is the right word, but I like at least that you're trying to take this, you know, Dwight Smith's call for decolonizing methods in praxis. You're trying to really do the work, and it is messy. It is without a clear endpoint at many times, but I think the work itself, like as you highlighted in your presentation, I really like that concept that you mentioned of, sorry, was it research writing as a method? I'm sorry, yeah.
Research creation or
Yeah,
practice-based research?
That was it, yeah. I really like that. I think that's very interesting because I think the work itself is already part of the product in a way. I have to say for this panel in general, the reason why I wanted to follow these panels was because they're slightly out of my comfort zone. So I really learned a lot. So thank you for that. But settler colonial studies, on the other hand, I am familiar with, which is why I found it interesting to read your bio. And I will send you some references after this because I don't know how familiar you are with the settler colonial cinema kind of angle in settler colonial studies. There's okay, great, because there's quite a bit written about that. And my question sort of comes from that is, if you want to comment on it, because it might not be something you really look at in your research, but I was wondering who initiates the initiatives, the documentary, and also the gains and types of things that you were talking about. Is it coming mostly from indigenous peoples, or is it mostly coming from settlers, or is it like a cooperation between them? And I'm asking that because, you know, when I was thinking about the initiatives that you mentioned, which I thought were really brilliant, like this Terra Nova, which is obviously a pun on Terra Nullius, the myth of the empty land, so that was quite interesting. I was wondering, you know, on the one hand, coming back to empathy, right, there's a potential here to really increase the empathy that, you know, on the part of settlers to sort of do the work of undoing settler colonialism. But on the other hand, I was wondering if, you know, you speak about alternative histories and contingencies and non-linear paths. Obviously, that is something that can also destabilize a lot of, you know, history-based campaigns of indigenous activists, if you know what I'm trying to say, as if, you know, history could be different and there could be other types of contingencies, thereby sort of erasing, you know, the harsh realities of settler colonialism. Is that?
I think there's like a few questions. Thank you so much, Rafael. I think there's a few questions in there. I'm going to start from reverse just so I can kind of, and then please like interject if I kind of forgot some points. But I think the reason for why I was really drawn to the work of Homi K. Bhabha in this position is because we're trying not to erase the past or consider, oh, that we could have gone this way or this way, but to bring it forward at every step of the way while we're in the present in thinking about future. And I think that of this off because a lot of the time folks think that if we just kind of move forward or we think about decolonization, we're thinking about kind of an erasure or kind of a moving backward and then forward. So this strange time lag that I think Bhabha is drawing from, I think Fanon on this point about that. And so one of the really important things, and it's also really dangerous that I have to make sure I do in my work and other folks have to make sure they're doing in their work, is to reassert that we don't want to erase or forget. And when we erase or forget, we kind of feed into this almost affirmative action or really liberal notion of moving towards a great future of progress together by forgetting what we did in the past. And as we know, generational trauma continues and it will continue. So having that meeting place or that liminal space that accepts the past and also the present, where we can kind of join together is really crucial, I think. And now I'm forgetting other points. Yes, so I think it's a great question you ask about settler colonialism, where that kind of, those documentaries are initiated, because unfortunately, a lot of the time, just based on the structure and the films that are currently available on like the National Film Board of Canada, a lot of the time they are funded using an agency that has a lot of issues of its own when it relates to who is provided with the funding to create the pieces and which ones are the ones that are showcased. So a lot of the time you will have individuals who are perhaps very committed to anti-colonial practices who will then reach out to community members to collaborate with. There's actually a recent publication of March 17th on nonlinear documentary and specific anti-oppressive methodologies, which unfortunately I have yet to read as it was just published. And I'm also in my comprehensive examination, so I can't be adding other things. But I think that piece, I hope, will be really kind of useful for the question that you have and that I have about, well, if a lot of the time the individuals who are given that space to create these pieces are folks who already have had this privilege, then are we really moving towards something that is perhaps collaborative and free of particular oppressive pasts, which I'm not sure, but I also know that there's definitely a lot of work yet to be done. I feel like there was another question in there, Rafael, so I apologize.
I don't remember myself. I think you've addressed all of them. So thank you for that. I think more work needs to be done is a nice way to end. I do want to thank all of you once again for really great papers and interesting thoughts. Hope we can get keep the conversation going. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Mm.
Thanks,
Thank you
Rafael.
so much. Thank you. And Steve and Shanice, thank you. And Rafael.